Hello, all of our early attendees. Thanks so much for joining. We'll get started here in just a moment. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll get started in just a few seconds. Let folks keep trickling on in. All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, The Role of Nuclear Energy in Combating Climate Change. My name is Sarah Viken. I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a great program lined up for you today featuring two contributors to the debate from the latest issue of the Environmental Forum, Is More Nuclear Energy Essential to Combat Climate Change? You can find the link to this article on the event webpage and more information about the Environmental Forum under the Resources and Periodical section of our website at eli.org. We're lucky to have Edwin Lyman and Jackie Toth, both contributors to this article, joining us today, and Mason Emnett moderating this conversation. We're grateful to these three leaders for taking the time to discuss such an important topic with ELI's audience. Today's program will begin with introductory remarks from each speaker and transition into a discussion format for the majority of the hour. We'll be taking audience questions during this time, so please submit any questions that you have throughout the program using Zoom's Q&A function. We encourage you to use the chat for any observations and comments, but please be aware that we'll be pulling discussion questions exclusively from the Q&A box. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the event webpage for ELI members to view later. So if you're an ELI member, the recording will be available within a few business days. You can find the recording as well as more information on becoming a member again at eli.org. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce our lovely moderator leading today's discussion. Will be Mason Emnett, who sits on ELI's Board of Directors and Leadership Council. Mason is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at Constellation Energy Corporation, where he oversees the development and implementation of federal legislative and regulatory strategy. Prior to joining Constellation, Mason was the Vice President of Competitive Market Policy at Exelon Corp, where he led efforts for achieving Exelon's policy objectives in matters before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and EPA. Earlier, Mason was Senior FERC Counsel at NextEra Energy, Inc., where he provided legal support and strategic advice on federal regulatory matters. Before joining NextEra in 2014, he served as Deputy Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation at FERC, where he led the development of regulations and rules governing wholesale electric markets and the provision of interstate transmission service. Prior to joining in 2006, Mason was in private practice with the law firm of Skadden, Arp, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, LLP. Thank you, Mason, for facilitating today's program. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to be here with Jackie Toth, Managing Director of Policy and External Affairs over Good Energy Collective, and Ed Lyman. He is Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Good Energy Collective is a nonprofit organization advancing community-centered policies to enable the adoption of advanced nuclear energy. And prior to joining Good, Jackie was the advisor for policy and content for the climate and energy program at the think tank Third Way. And she's a former journalist, having reported on federal energy and environmental law, regulations, and politics at CQ Roll Call and Morning Consult. And Jackie has testified to Congress on the importance of nuclear energy in a climate-constrained world and speaks frequently with the press on nuclear issues. The Union of Concerned Scientists, where Ed is joining us from, is a national nonprofit that puts rigorous, independent science into action, developing solutions and advocating for a healthy, safe, and just future. Ed is a co-author with David Lochbaum and Susan Stranahan of the book Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster. It was issued by New Press in 2014. He earned a doctorate in physics from Cornell University in 1992 and is the recipient of the 2018 Leo Szilard Lectureship Award from the American Physical Society. From 2020 to 2022, Ed served on a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine panel examining the merits and viability of advanced nuclear energy reactor fuel cycles. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm with Constellation Energy. We're the largest owner and operator of nuclear power plants in the country. We also own wind, solar, and hydro generators, resulting in a total portfolio of 90% of the electricity we produce coming from carbon-free resources, the bulk of which that is from the 25 nuclear units in that portfolio. So we thank everybody for joining today. Nuclear energy, I'm going to kind of kick us off with a little bit of a general discussion. And then turn it over to Jackie and Ed. But as noted in the forum that Sarah mentioned, nuclear energy has been getting a lot of attention lately. And we joined the discussion at ELI by hosting the debate on whether more nuclear energy is essential to combat climate change. And you can find that in the March-April issue of the Environmental Forum. As Sarah mentioned, Jackie and Ed are contributors with articles. I encourage everybody to take a look and give them a read. So before turning to them, I wanted to just take a minute to go over some facts about nuclear energy. The U.S. currently gets about 20% of its electricity from nuclear power and about 50% of its carbon-free electricity. Nuclear plants are very long-lived assets. And so the kind of question before us now is, what should the future of the existing fleet be? And then should we be expanding on the existing fleet with new nuclear technologies? The current fleet of reactors mostly came online in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s and were licensed to operate for 40 years. Many have renewed their operating licenses for an additional 20 years, effectively having rebuilt their major components over time to increase both safety and efficiency. And for many years, most of the discussion around nuclear energy has had to do with managing used fuel. And those conversations continue, and we'll get into that a little bit today. But an increasing number of folks are talking about the environmental and reliability benefits of nuclear power and how preserving those benefits from the existing fleet and expanding on them to build new reactors with advanced designs can help address the climate crisis. So most researchers agree that when you look across the power system, we need to remove most of the carbon from the power sector in order to decarbonize other sectors, transitioning from the use of fossil fuels to the use of clean electricity for things like industrial processes, transportation, agricultural processes. So that means we need to vastly increase our sources of clean electricity. And those generators are going to need to have the ability to produce power at all times and during all weather conditions. And so we'll need a portfolio of resources. We'll need what's referred to as kind of firm or dispatchable generation. We'll need weather variable resources. We'll need small resources, large resources. That's all going to need to work together in order to achieve our decarbonization outcomes. But that also means that we need to keep every existing resource, every source of carbon-free power, like our nuclear plants, running for as long as possible. The slide that displayed shows some of the advantages of nuclear power compared to other forms of carbon-free electricity. A high capacity factor, meaning that it runs continuously in all conditions. Nuclear plants have long operating lives, meaning that they are rebuilt over time to enhance safety and reliability. They're zero emissions, they're safe, and they control every gram of the waste resulting from the fuel cycle. This has led policymakers at the federal and state level to implement a number of programs designed to prevent the retirement of nuclear plants and support the development of new nuclear technologies. That includes a federal production tax credit adopted in the Inflation Reduction Act, referred to as 45U for its section of the tax code. That runs through 2032, which itself is built on state programs that have been enacted over the last roughly decade, designed to prevent the early retirement of about 24 nuclear units. So some question the merit of these policies, suggesting the country should move away from nuclear and rely more heavily on wind and solar in combination with batteries, hydropower, geothermal, and other technologies. And that brings us to today's conversation. Jackie and Ed have written on this question in the forum, as we mentioned. So I'm going to turn it over to them for some opening remarks and then go through questions where we can talk about the metrics and criteria, such as those reflected on this slide. So do please drop your own questions through the submit question function. I'll be monitoring that with help from the ELI team. We'll try and weave those into the discussion, and then we'll come back to any unanswered questions at the end. So Turning over to you, Jackie, can you open us up with your perspectives on the question of the use of nuclear power?
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Mason, and a huge thank you to Environmental Law Institute for hosting this debate, first in print and now virtually today. Very pleased to be here and with that on this important topic. By way of quick personal introduction, I grew up an hour north of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania in a pretty typical progressive household. Typical in that I was definitely not thinking about where my electricity was coming from as a kid. But then I came to DC, and being typical kind of went out the window. My first job out of college, as Mason mentioned, was as a journalist covering energy and environment laws and regulations on Capitol Hill. And this is when I learned that the state I had grown up in for 17 years of my life was getting 31% of its electricity from its nuclear reactors, which was more than 90% of its carbon-free electricity. And the reason I learned that is because my beat as a journalist was in advanced nuclear energy. So these being new next generation nuclear technologies that in many ways are built on concepts that were explored in the national labs 60 to 70 years ago. And in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, there was so much technological innovation and policy intervention occurring to be able to bring these technologies to market. This is when I met Ed and engaged frequently on these topics. It was also a topic of great bipartisan collaboration, which as a journalist in DC was definitely refreshing. Congress can usually barely agree on the color of an orange. So this was a rare spot of light in energy policy. And around the same period, you also saw another trend happening, which was progressives like me were looking at how are we going to address this global issue of climate change in a way that was still going to be true to our progressive values of community engagement, public health, and environmental justice. And all of that was embodied in the Green New Deal resolution from Senator Markey and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And when I interviewed Representative Ocasio-Cortez about the Green New Deal in 2019, she told me that it leaves the door open to nuclear energy. And this was marking a shift in environmentalism because historically in the United States, a lot of environmentalists cut their teeth on protesting protesting nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, or had more localized concerns about contamination in their neighborhoods. But with this global issue of climate change taking precedence, a lot of us as progressives were thinking about how do we address this issue? And in that vein, we're interested in giving nuclear energy a second look. And that's the context in which my organization, Good Energy Collective, was founded in 2020 by 3 women to make the progressive case for nuclear energy, which doesn't just mean, making information available as we do to more communities about nuclear, making that information more accessible, but equally learning from communities about what it is they want from their energy mix, and also understanding what it's going to take for the government and for the nuclear industry to gain their trust in nuclear technologies. Is it, for example, advancing and solving the nuclear waste issue? Well, great, but that's something we're working on. Is it seeing more early, frequent engagement from developers about siting potential nuclear projects? There are real procedural justice advancements that nuclear can make, like other energy infrastructure, and we work on informing industry of ways they can do a better job at that. So much of our work is local, because even in a global crisis like climate change, the views and the visions of communities and what they want from their energy mix and their energy future is important. They deserve to have accurate information and a say in how and where they get their electricity. And nuclear is an option for them. So I'll stop there, but very excited for this discussion and looking forward to all of your questions.
Great. Well, thanks for getting us started. Let's hop over to you, Ed.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I'd say that I have a somewhat different perspective of the events of the last few years and the last few decades with regard to nuclear power. So first, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is now more than 50 years old, is an organization that was founded in 1969 by MIT faculty and graduate students to address the role of science and scientists in public policy issues, in particular with regard to security at that time, the Vietnam War in particular. And one of the first issues that UCS took on was the burgeoning nuclear power industry and the lack of appropriate regulation for the fleet of nuclear power plants that the Atomic Energy Commission was engaged in promoting as well as regulating. And so historically, that's been an issue that UCS has addressed over its entire lifetime. Of course, as the world has changed and evolved, UCS's own interests and priorities have also continued to shift. The mitigation of climate change is, of course, a top priority for our organization today. But we haven't lost sight of the issues regarding nuclear power, and the fact that although nuclear power is a low carbon energy generating technology compared to fossil fuels, it also brings to the table significant liabilities and risks. And you can't dismiss those, you can't wish them away, and you certainly shouldn't engage in public relations exercises to gaslight the public into thinking that nuclear power is a completely benign energy source. It's not. It has significant safety risks, as the world saw with the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. And in particular, it's unique among energy sources in that the same facilities and materials that are used to generate civilian power can also be misused by countries or terrorists to make nuclear weapons materials. And the potential for a nuclear proliferation or nuclear terrorism is an existential threat as well. So you have to address those. Unfortunately, what I've seen over the last several decades is that the nuclear industry, which has struggled to be relevant given its excessive cost and the fact that private capital has largely not been interested in financing nuclear power plants, especially in view of the fact that they have not turned out to be very good investments insofar as getting good returns over a reasonable time scale, especially for new plants. There's been a lack of private investment, and that led nuclear power to stagnate until recently, when the public sector has gotten more engaged in providing subsidies for nuclear power to get over this hump of lack of private investment, with the hope that crossing that valley of death would actually lead to spurring actual or opening the floodgates for private investment. And it's still yet to be seen whether that's going to happen. But this hasn't been an organic process. The nuclear industry has been promoting its potential role in mitigating climate change again for decades. That has led to periods of time when it looked like there might be a nuclear renaissance, but that fizzled out a couple of times for various reasons over the last few decades. But the ideas keep coming back. And the bottom line here is that you can't throw nuclear safety and security under the bus in the name of promoting mitigation of climate change. There are alternatives, there are alternative futures, and depending on who you talk to, those futures really reflect the technological biases that people have, whether or not the extent to which they believe, for instance, that the technological hurdles that have made nuclear power too expensive and have raised consistent safety and security questions can be overcome rapidly in a way which will lead to the ability for nuclear power to rapidly expand over the next few decades. You can compare those technical challenges and financial challenges to those of alternatives, for instance, say more renewable heavy grid coupled with long duration battery storage and more transmission to compensate for the variable nature of wind and solar resources. And so it really is this question of what do you believe, where do you put your confidence in technology? And that leads to direction for public policy and for both private and public resources. And the question is that being allocated in a rational way today based on the real risks and benefits of the alternative technologies? And I'm afraid that because rational, unfortunately, is not necessarily the right way to describe the evolution of the energy sector. It's more a battle of special interests who are trying to get essentially their technologies getting the attention of both private capital and public investment in financing what they want to do. And so unfortunately, it's really where those special interests, how they exert their influence and who's winning at any particular time. Nuclear power has achieved this change in public perception, which was, again, not organic, but was largely driven, I believe, by public relations and communications efforts to try to turn the tide, financed by a few large donors who became interested in nuclear power, for instance, Bill Gates. And I think that's largely what's driving the changes in public perception, as well as interest in Capitol Hill and the administration in subsidizing nuclear power. And the bottom line for us is that you can't compromise on nuclear safety and security, but the problem is that, for instance, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is being scapegoated unfairly as an obstacle by many of these stakeholders, with the belief that somehow safety and security regulations are dinosaurs, they're not appropriate for a fleet of advanced nuclear reactors in the future, and therefore they should lighten up. And the bottom line here is trying to make nuclear power cheaper, but the question is, can you really make it cheaper and safer at the same time? And I think the jury's out on that, and I probably talked too long for now, so I'll defer to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thanks for getting us started. A lot of the issues that we want to cover in the conversation. So I guess I'd like to start with kind of bringing us back to the common thread of both of your remarks of, question is decarbonization, right? That a lot of the policy conversation and the public conversation around use of nuclear really has to do with first, an acknowledgement of the volume of carbon-free electricity that's coming out of our existing fleet. And then as we're looking forward and kind of reaching consensus that successful decarbonization of our economy is going to turn on decarbonization of our power sector. And we're going to need to be able to power things like EVs, heating systems, other activities that are currently based, powered by fossil fuels, and move them to, electrification, which then means we need growing amounts of carbon-free electricity. So can both of y'all, maybe we'll go to Jackie and then Ed, talk about that a little bit further, in the context of what may be, doubling, tripling the amount of clean energy we need on the system. Then how do you see the role of nuclear power in that transition? And if it's not nuclear, then you touched on this a little bit, Ed, like what is the alternative, and is how realistic is it that we can achieve those alternatives over time in relation to the role of nuclear? So Jackie, start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mason. There's a twofold answer here. There is a clear role for keeping existing nuclear online, putting electrons on the grid without releasing any carbon emissions. And there's a role for additional nuclear to meet the scaling global demand for electricity and heat that, Mason, as you mentioned, the electrification of other sectors of our economy are really putting pressure on the need to scale clean energy. So on keeping nuclear reactors that are already operating online, I think at this point, this is not seriously debated. Even Ed's organization in 2018 indicated in a report that if methane gas or coal are what's going to be replacing nuclear generation taken offline, it's not a good thing. And policymakers should, as the report indicated, look at things like low carbon electricity standards to prevent that outcome. And this is a real issue. When the Indian Point nuclear plant closed just north of New York City in 2021, methane gas filled in the gap. And The Guardian just reported this month that New York City's average regional carbon emissions per megawatt hour are actually worse than the average in the state of Texas. which is a really awkward position for New York City to be in. When a nuclear plant closes, it wipes a ton of carbon-free electricity off the grid. There have been a lot of closures of nuclear reactors premature in the Northeast region since 2009. The closure of 6 reactors in that region was generating 5.7 times the amount of increase in solar generation added in the region over the same period, which means that with the retirements of nuclear, even with all of that added solar capacity, clean generation declined by 30 million megawatt hours from 2009 to 2022. It just makes it that much harder to decarbonize. And the flip side of this is, of course, that new nuclear helps carbon-free generation scale. And the challenge is such that we need more. I think the most sobering statistic in energy from the International Energy Agency is that in 1973, 87% of our total global energy supply came from fossil fuels. In 2019, it was still 81%. We have a really far way to go. The United States recognizes this, and we're not alone. 21 other countries came together at COP in Dubai in December and said, we want to work together to triple global nuclear capacity. It's not a pipe dream. In Brussels just last week, they hosted the first ever nuclear energy summit, convening the IAEA, European Union, and over 30 countries, talking about how are we going to make new nuclear happen globally to address climate change and energy security.
Great, thank you. Ed?
Yeah, and thanks. And so I think, again, fundamentally, the messaging that we have to have an all of the above strategy, it's self-serving for all the individual components of that, including nuclear industry. And, to start out with such a blanket, constraint, I think is too constraining. There are certainly pathways that researchers have identified where if society chose to reduce the reliance or even eliminate on nuclear power, there are directions that could be achieved. And there are others that claim that it would simply be too hard. I think there's reasonable room for disagreement on any of those pathways. But I don't think, to say that there's some inevitability about the role of nuclear power in the future is simply tunnel vision. And it's a message, again, that's serving the interests of the industry. I would, with regard to operating plants, Jackie pointed out the study that we put out in 2018 regarding criteria for when we thought, public support for preserving nuclear generation might be appropriate, but there are pretty strict criteria. And in fact, today, very few nuclear plants actually have met those criteria. The Department of Energy created the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, provided $6 billion for to try to address this crisis that some people were claiming, that there would be a large-scale shutdown of aging nuclear plants because they were not economic. That money actually, but the applicants for that actually had to demonstrate that they had a real need for that money. In fact, there's only been one taker so far, and that's the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Plant in California. Turns out, based on fluctuations of the energy market, that that most plants could not justify the need for that money, and so it's largely unspent. Our concerns, however, with that program are that it didn't have very strict safety criteria, and we think that it's really essential if the public sector is going to provide funding to lengthen the lifetime of nuclear plants, that they have to address safety issues that, to the extent that public health will be preserved to a high extent. And there are just many, over the last couple of decades, there have just been many areas in which nuclear plants have sought and often successfully gotten a weakening of safety and security standards that reduced their operating cost burden. I'd say that Constellation and its predecessor Exelon, my observation of the NRC over many years was that they were pretty aggressive in pushing the agency for those kinds of changes, especially in security. And we don't think that's necessarily appropriate if public funding is going to be provided to subsidize nuclear plants, that there has to be, that money has to largely flow into ensuring safety and security and not necessarily improving the profitability or the lining the pockets of investors. And the Civil Nuclear Credit Program had very minimal safety criteria. For example, after the Fukushima disaster, there were many ideas that were proposed for bolstering the protection of nuclear plants against the kind of natural disasters that caused the Fukushima, including upgrading, flooding, and seismic risks. But the NRC ultimately ended up not really imposing most of those additional requirements. And therefore, we have concerns about the vulnerability of the existing fleet, for instance, to the flooding that not only we might expect due to climate change and increased flooding hazards, but the flooding risks that these plants face today, they're not currently protected against that level of flooding risk. So we think that there is room, for bolstering the safety of the operating fleet, and the public money has a role in that if it's going to be provided, but the policy mechanisms right now don't support that. So we're concerned about that program going forward. With regard to new reactors, we can talk about that later. But again, when you think about nuclear power fitting into a future energy mix, then there are a lot of considerations about whether it's actually the appropriate tool to fill in those gaps that are created by variable resources. And the fundamental cost and time of deployment are really factors that have to be seriously considered. And I think we're going to be discussing that in the next question. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mason, can I jump in on a couple of these points before we move forward?
Sure.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to make sure everyone understood. I mean, the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, that wasn't just a fly-by-night program that the DOE decided willy-nilly to produce. This was one of the largest programs within the bipartisan infrastructure law that Congress recognized, again, as we talked about, the utility of keeping our existing reactor fleet online for clean energy, for energy security. It was actually the first program that the Biden administration successfully stood up in implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there were some strict application criteria, which may have indicated, led to fewer applicants than folks thought. But more of the reason why fewer have applied for the program support is that now we have in the Inflation Reduction Act, investment and production tax credits, including for existing reactors, that are simply a little bit simpler in terms of being able to access by the utilities that support. So I just wanted to mention that. I mean, on Fukushima and the subsequent NRC license requirements and safety requirements on reactor fleets, my team was just out at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Plant in San Luis Obispo last week. And I can say, we were shown they have this large warehouse that looks kind of like a Home Depot, and it is filled to the brim with excess safety equipment, backup diesel generators, piping that can be quickly assembled and put into the reservoir to bring water in to the facility if they lose that water access. All of that is because of increased safety requirements post Fukushima. And on this question of all renewables or not, listen, before I learned about energy systems as a little kid in Pennsylvania, I for sure thought that, renewables good, coal, natural gas, oil bad, didn't think about nuclear at all. But it's really more complicated than simply being able to blanket the country with wind and solar and batteries. I think for one thing, not everyone is as jazzed about renewables as we'd hope. I mean, right now, 15% of US counties have restrictions on new renewable projects. and the rate of those restrictions is increasing. Right now, renewables projects just aren't even panning out everywhere. A Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study recently showed that 30% of renewables projects that have applied for permits in the last 5 years have been canceled. And there's this other issue that we haven't discussed and might later, which is, the interconnection capability. There's a backlog in being able to connect new projects of any kind to the grid. This is especially problematic right now in the PJM Regional Transmission Organization that serves a lot of the lower Northeast and some of the Midwest. The backlog is such that a lot of these projects just simply fizzle out. So Mason, I'll turn it back to you, but let's see, these are
Well, so how is this going to go? Are we just going to go back and forth like this? Because she raised a few issues I'd like to rebut.
Well, go ahead, and I'd like to address, you specifically referred to my company, so I would like to take that up.
Well, just on the flex equipment, that's the warehouse that Jackie was just talking about. The problem is that equipment, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission decided not to require that equipment has to be protected against the current seismic and flooding hazards that the reactors actually determine they currently face. There's a policy decision not to require that. So there's no guarantee that that warehouse is even going to survive a worst case earthquake at Diablo Canyon, be usable. And that's the kind of problem I'm talking about.
Yeah, and so I guess that links to my question, or the response. You pointed to my company's obviously active with the NRC, as all stakeholders are, right? We are the largest operator of nuclear plants, and we have the most people hours of experience in running them, we believe, very safely. And so we are going to share that experience and our insight and our recommendations. And ultimately, it's up to the regulator to make the call, right? And we comply, obviously, with all requirements. And in many instances, we go above and beyond them. And so, I think across the nuclear industry, we understand very much the need for constant attention to safety measures, and that is incorporated in everything we do. There is a higher level question about whether for some nuclear can ever be safe enough, right? You raised the question, Jackie. I'm glad you mentioned the PTC in terms of the before the Civil Nuclear Credit Program was implemented. States were taking action, and it was only because of those states taking action that 23 of our reactors in the country, so that's about a quarter of the entire fleet, are operating because they stepped in to prevent the retirement. So there is a complicated story going on, most certainly, and all of us are a part of that conversation. So I think that takes us, one of the questions that came in, I've been trying to monitor the questions on my iPad and then the side panel. One question goes kind of, again, pulling this thread of, okay, well, if it's not nuclear, what are the alternatives? And the question is, what are the other sources of on-demand power that when the wind isn't blowing, you don't get output from wind, when there's no sun, you don't get solar. So isn't nuclear the only low carbon alternative currently that can fill that role? So I don't know, Ed, you want to take that and then go to Jackie?
Well, I'm not an expert on aspects of, my focus is nuclear, so I'm not the best person to address all the innovations that have occurred, but certainly, there are experts who have defined low or no nuclear future pathways. Again, if that's desirable, that would require certain certain holes to be filled. For instance, the issue of better storage is key to addressing variable resources. Better transmission, for one thing, but again, you have to consider the alternatives and whether nuclear is really the right tool to fit. The fact is that having baseload generation that runs 24 hours a day is not necessarily the best tool for addressing this grid of the future. In fact, as Mason knows, certainly in the Midwest, for example, you have the situations where the nuclear power is so expensive that it has to lower its, it has to adjust its power rating to accommodate the those fluctuations in availability in sometimes unpredictable ways. And that is actually not necessarily a safe thing for certainly conventional nuclear power plants to do. And there's no real evidence that new types of nuclear power plants would be able to handle fluctuations in power level or load following any better. So it's not clear that having large plants that are only really economical if they run 24 hours a day are what we need. So there's that consideration as well. But again, I would defer, to look at the range of energy pathways that have been defined, and there are certainly those, there are plausible ones that don't have nuclear power in them, as well as some that do. But you have to, again, consider the technological leaps and hurdles that would be needed. And, a lot of the claims about how nuclear power can scale up, how we can have this new generation of new plants that will be quicker and cheaper to build than the behemoths that have weighted down the industry until now. Those are largely unproven, and there are a lot of arguments for reason to be skeptical about these claims and whether it can actually do the job efficiently and affordably.
Well, Jackie, I'll turn to you, but I just want to, you said, that we are aware of high-priced nuclear plants in the Midwest and you need to turn down because we're too expensive compared to alternatives. I think you're referring to when marginal prices are very low on the system because of wind and solar being, on the margin, the bulk of the resources that are operating. Those resources are effectively zero marginal costs, and they can go to negative operating costs because of the way that the production tax credit works for them. So I wouldn't exactly characterize it as high-priced nuclear units. I would characterize it as periods in which the market is valuing electricity at a zero or a negative cost, and we still incur costs associated with operating. We actually believe that's a flaw with the market design, right? That the market itself is not acknowledging the benefit of all of the resources working together in order to ensure reliable operations under all conditions. But I think that's maybe where we would agree to disagree. But turn it over to you, Jackie, and then I'd like to go to, we've gotten a question, but then Ed raised kind of going forward. So also think about the role of nuclear, the reliability benefits, or the operational characteristics associated with nuclear. But then as we look to the future, Ed raised the question of costs of new nuclear. And so if you could address that as well.
Sure, there's so much to tackle here. Thank you, Mason. Well, good question from the audience there. I think that's really the foundational question here is, if not nuclear, what's available? I will say that with a lot of the advanced reactors under development today, a lot of them are smaller and, kind of more flexible in fitting into these different, grid requirements and levels of power that we might need across the country at different times. One fun thing to mention is that, the TerraPower demonstration out in Kemmer, Wyoming, as part of their Natrium reactor design, they're going to have a molten salt energy storage component, which would be able to ramp their constant 345 megawatt electric output up to 500 megawatts electric when necessary. So, even nuclear has some kind of energy battery storage technology opportunities that really come from the advancements we've made in the solar world. I did want to say, in terms of how to think about nuclear in connection with other clean energy technologies that offer the same benefits, one of my favorite points made in the Loan Programs Office report from 2023, the Liftoff report on advanced nuclear. The point it makes is that, nuclear, and this gets to the cost question, nuclear does not have to be cost commensurate with just solar or just methane gas. It has to be cost competitive with solar plus long duration storage or with natural gas plus carbon capture. And the analyses that the Energy Department has run has shown that advanced nuclear is going to be cost competitive with those two things. So it does fit in this, broader, all of the above vision for what kind of energy mix the United States is going to need to be able to stay reliable and have energy security. I don't know, we can talk more about the economics of all of this, but I just wanted to maybe mention too that the value that nuclear energy creates is such that a community that looks at what they really want from their energy mix, a solar or wind farm might be less expensive than a nuclear plant on paper, and it is less expensive. But the renewable project won't sustain the same level of consistent local economic development for the community. I mean, today's reactors support 500 to 800 permanent jobs. After construction, during construction, it's thousands of jobs on site, and they pay abundant state and local taxes and benefits that support local jobs, but also pay for local services like the local school systems or emergency preparedness functions that can make them an attractive option for a community looking at more than just we would like clean energy on site.
And to address these points, the fact is that the industry has been trying to argue that nuclear power is more flexible than these large behemoths and trying to pigeonhole it really into applications where maybe it doesn't make so much sense. So does it make sense to shrink down the size of nuclear plants? Well, the reason why nuclear plants have grown in size over the decades is because of economies of scale, because the unit price of electricity, all things else being equal, is going to be lower from a larger reactor than a smaller reactor. So these small modular reactors, as are being pitched, actually have an enormous economic disadvantage from the get-go because you're going against economies of scale. So they have to increasingly argue that there are going to be other factors that have not been proven that will compensate for this cost penalty, including great cost savings from being able to have mass manufacture, and the ability to pigeonhole or to shoehorn these plants into applications like providing process heat for chemical facilities, for powering data centers and crypto mines, for and again for load following to address that those variable resources and to maintain a steady grid as solar and wind fluctuate. And the fact is that it's still not clear that any of those additional applications make economic sense or are safe. One thing, when you because of that cost penalty from shrinking down the size of nuclear plants, it becomes even less feasible to have the kind of safety features that the current fleet has, including large pressure-resisting containments. And those are a big cost factor for a big part of the capital cost of nuclear plants. A lot of large reinforced concrete building built to very strict standards. But without that, you're increasing the risk to the public. I just came off a meeting at the NRC right before this call, where one of these so-called small modular reactor developers was discussing their safety analysis. This is a small liquid sodium cooled fast reactor called the ARC-100, and the numbers that they were putting out for the results of their safety analysis as far as the impact, the radiological impact on public health and safety at the site boundary, were actually quite eye-opening. And so they were trying to argue that they didn't need a physical containment for this reactor, but I would say the numbers they were putting out showed that they really do. And this is one of our concerns, is that are the kind of slashing of safety and security features to support the economic case for these small reactors going to compromise public health and safety? I'm afraid that the way things are going, the answer is yes.
If I could jump in here a little bit on small modular reactors. One thing Ed isn't mentioning is that the alternative to that, for data centers or chemical processors to receive the level of power that they need, it's methane gas or it's coal. Process heat, really, renewables can't provide what these producers require. Not everyone requires 1,000 megawatt size power plant. So being able to have different sizes available is attractive. And one of the things that my organization looks at in particular is being able to support communities facing the retirements of their coal plants with a nuclear reactor. The interconnection in these communities for the 300 to 500 megawatt coal plant that's under retirement is ready for a 300 to 500 megawatt nuclear reactor, but not necessarily for 1,000 megawatts. The grid isn't such that it would accommodate that as simply. So in that way, small modular reactors have a lot of different applications, many of which you mentioned, that I wouldn't write off so quickly.
Yep, and I do want to kind of drill down on, I think we've addressed this safety question, you know, from multiple angles. Is a thread through both of your perspectives is, so we know that we're going to need larger amounts of carbon-free generation moving forward. We have an existing technology in the form of nuclear that has some raised questions as to expanding nuclear energy and our safety. We've got some questions in the chat on used fuel as well. I want to get to those. And so is it a better bet, right, for the country to continue to rely and expand nuclear energy, a known technology that can solve for the dispatchable needs of the power system as we need an increasing amount of carbon-free energy, and then deal with things like safety, used fuel, other considerations? Or is the better path to ramp away from nuclear to other technologies that are unknown? Is, I think, the open question. I think there is consensus across the power industry that a firm dispatchable source of carbon-free energy is needed. Wind, solar with batteries is not going to work from an operational perspective in terms of complete sustainable operation of the power system. So that does take you to a question of, will that be geothermal? Will it be something else? Will it be clean hydrogen powering turbines? And that is a bit of the metaphysical question here of, should we be pivoting away from a known technology that can solve the problem of decarbonization, right, in collaboration with other resources, or should we be leaning into the development, of new technologies? And it sounds like, Ed, you would lean towards the new, and Jackie, you would lean towards the nuclear having a role in that.
Well, I would question the premise that most of these small modular reactors and these reactors that use non-water coolants are not known technologies. That's not doing what the operating experience supports. The operating experience with nuclear are the large plants that the Constellation runs, for example, on the order of 1,000 megawatts, cooled with light water, where there is considerable operating experience, and even so, there are still surprises that are being found. Just heard NRC meeting earlier this week that a new mechanism for valve failure was detected. This is something, you'd think that by now the light water reactor fleet, they'd know pretty well all the things that can go wrong with valves, and you know how important the valves are really in the safe operation of nuclear plants. They discovered a new failure mechanism that may have generic implications. So they're still learning about the current fleet. But when you start talking about the exotic menagerie of reactor types that are being proposed, which use radically different designs, different coolants, materials that in many cases have not been developed or qualified for the service that they're being claimed, or that they'll need to be, safety and security issues that are a long way from being resolved. That's an experimental technology. That's not what we're talking about. Even the Vogtle 3 and 4, which are evolutionary variants of large light water reactors, had raised some safety issues which are still not completely resolved. And those are the ones that the industry needs to convince the public they're not going to repeat the mistakes of, because that Vogtle project in Georgia, these 2,000 megawatt AP1000 reactors were designed on the premise that they were going to be able to build, they could be built more quickly, that they would have much fewer, much reduced footprint, fewer safety systems, less material, and that would lead to significant cost savings. And that actually didn't happen. They turned out to be super expensive. So, so the actual to repeat what we know would really mean again learning lessons of Vogtle and the operating fleet and building these large light water reactors, and that's not what the industry is tending toward. Partly because I believe they know that they're trying to show the public that they're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past, that they're doing something new, that they're innovative, but unfortunately, it's not nearly as clear cut.
Jackie?
Yeah, Mason, to answer your original question, I think as things stand today, most reliable energy models do show that you would need to overbuild renewable capacity significantly to accommodate the times when they're just not always putting electrons on the grid. Renewables could reliably get us at least halfway to decarbonization, but not all the way. There's a good study in 2021 in Issues in Science and Technology with Jesse Jenkins and others that found that for California, for example, you'd need to build almost 500 gigawatts of solar and wind to ensure reliably consistent generation. 500 gigawatts is about half of the entire US electricity generation amount today. So that would raise electricity rates a ton in the state if you could do it, which isn't assured, because that would mean building solar at 10 times the speed that we've ever achieved in the United States. And think of the transmission build out, and we know how difficult it is. Mason, you probably know better than most how to site and complete a transmission project these days. But nuclear pairs well with these other clean energy technologies and helps modernize and strengthen the grid. So we yes, to your question, we believe we should lean in on new nuclear deployments and keep our existing ones open.
Well, I do in our final minutes appreciate all the questions that are coming in. We are not going to get to all of them or even the prepared questions that I had. This has been an active discussion, but I don't feel like we can leave a discussion about nuclear energy without talking about used fuel. So would like each of you to address that. We obviously know something about that. Being a large nuclear operator, we safely store all of our fuel. We would like a central repository as a matter of national policy. That doesn't exist, and so we handle that at each of our sites. But first maybe go with you, Ed, and then to Jackie, just to touch on the issues associated with used fuel management.
Right, and we call it sped fuel. This is the problem that the industry has kicked down the road since its inception. It was originally thought to be a non-issue back in the 1950s. The problem here is that the radioactive waste produced by nuclear power plants, as a matter of course, contains isotopes that remain hazardous and can endanger public health and the environment for hundreds of thousands of years. And they also contain plutonium, which, if separated, is a nuclear weapons usable material. So the fuel has to be protected both against long-term environmental hazards and also against security threats. And the solution to that long-term problem is underground geologic disposal in a repository where there's assurance that it'll isolate the waste for the period of time that it needs to be isolated. And that has, that raises a lot of technical and policy questions, but it's really the only alternative for the long-term management of spent nuclear fuel. And that's the one that's been proven completely elusive here in the United States and most countries around the world, where nuclear power plants continue to store all the waste that they've generated over their operating lifetime at the sites. And the US program for developing a geologic repository was canceled, and there's essentially nothing replacing at this point. So we are facing this issue of whether we continue to run nuclear power plants and expand nuclear power without actually having a plan in place to develop that geologic repository, which is the only safe long-term alternative.
And Jackie, your view?
Yes, I know we've got very little time left, so I'll be brief, but this is an area in which Ed and I agree that we really need to make progress on spent fuel storage and disposition. This is, from our perspective at Good Energy Collective, a justice issue. I mean, it is stored safely, which is important. You know, no one wants a nuclear waste release into the environment. We have very secure casks, you know, to store the waste. But it is stored at, you know, over 70 sites around the country in over 35 states. And the surrounding communities never agreed to host this waste long term. They would like it to move. It is the DOE's statutory responsibility under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to take title to that waste and move it into a deep geologic repository, as Ed has mentioned, or what they're also currently looking at, which is interim waste storage as a solution until we identify a site that will not be Yucca Mountain for the waste disposal long term. So my organization is an awardee of the Energy Department's consent-based siting program to identify one or more sites for consolidated interim storage facilities. So my team is talking with communities around the country, identifying what would a just siting process look like to store this waste and identify how the DOE could make sure they identify a willing and informed community to host that waste, the same as Sweden and Finland and soon to be Canada are also doing. I know we're at the hour.
Yep, and it is nice to end on a note of consensus. We also hope for that outcome as a matter of just putting things in perspective, so folks can understand it. If you put together all of the spent fuel or used fuel of the commercial reactor fleet since its operation would fit on a football field 3 meters high, and so it is very important to maintain safe, disposal of that. Volume-wise, it is something that is manageable. We have political issues to overcome on that, but we know where every gram of that is. It is highly controlled and maintained safely. And from the nuclear operator perspective, we're not using the sky as our dumping ground. The coal fleet produces the same amount of particulate matter dumped into the fuel in an hour that we do over the entire operating history of our fleet. So it's something that we take very seriously, and we also, hope for a resolution in terms of the long-term issue. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Sarah. Appreciate the time. Appreciate Ed, Jackie. This was a great conversation, and for everybody else for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone, including you, Mason. You were really willing to step up and dive into the details. This is a very complex topic. I feel like we've scratched the surface and we could go on for another hour. Questions are still coming in as I speak, so thank you to all of our attendees for all of your questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to them. There's definitely a lot more on this in the environmental forum debate, so check that out. It's on the event webpage as well. We appreciate everybody joining us to speak, to listen, to learn, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. If you couldn't attend the full webinar, members will be able to watch the recording. Again, it'll be on that event webpage. I just put the link in the chat. We hope to see you at future programming. You can find it at eli.org. So thank you all and have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.